Hello all. In my previous video, I answered the question, should an alcoholic or should a Christian go to Alcoholics Anonymous? And I have many notes about how the best parts of the big book are already in the Bible. And I was wanting to make longer videos with clips and music and pictures, but I want to do other things. But I have so many notes that I will just make some shorter videos with some of my notes. And I've already tried a couple of these that I didn't like. I left a couple things out. And I sound like I have YouTube preacher voice. And I despise it in myself, but I can't control it. This book, commonly known by its nickname as the Big Book, is actually titled Alcoholics Anonymous. And that phrase, that two-word phrase, originated with this book. And that phrase eventually came to signify the program and the society, the fellowship, the business, the nonprofit that AA became, and all this stuff around it. But those two words that were just the name of this book, what do they mean? I think those two words, in my opinion, almost summarize the entire program of AA. I think if you just focused on the fact that you're an alcoholic who's trying to be anonymous, you would make progress. What is alcoholic? This book spends a lot of pages on that. Probably more than 40 pages talking about what that is. And it's important. But put simply, an alcoholic is someone who cannot control their drinking and whose life has become unmanageable. When we get a little deeper into it, we find that most of us find, and the book says, that selfishness and self-centeredness, that was the root of our troubles. And it later says bottles were only a symbol. So that's what alcoholism is. I mean, people might argue, but either way, selfishness and self-centeredness is the root of our troubles. And then what is anonymous? What does that mean? Well, put simply, it just means that nobody's going to reveal your identity as a member of AA. Nobody's going to mention it if you go to a meeting outside of the meeting, which is funny because most people who are drunks are known as drunks. Once you go a little deeper into it, you find that, well, anonymity also means that no one is going to be a representative of AA in the public, like especially in the press. Of course, people do that all the time. They quote-unquote break their anonymity. But for the most part, most members of AA try to hold up to that. And we think that that's one of the things that's kept AA so strong for so many years, is people adhering to the principle of anonymity. But once you go a little bit closer, in Tradition 12, it says anonymity has immense spiritual significance, that we ought to practice a genuine humility. So it's connecting anonymity with humility. When I was new and I was talking to a sponsor, he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I want to be a respected citizen of my community." And he said, "You should forget about that. You should just worry about being an anonymous member of your community. And then you'll end up getting respected anyway." So I think that's what he was talking about, connecting humility with anonymity. So you could almost nickname the book again, Selfishness and Humility. You could nickname it whatever you want, but that's what I'm doing for this video. But That's not an original idea, actually, putting those things together. This isn't an exact analog, but I think it's pretty close. I think that the idea of Alcoholics Anonymous, of that phrase, is contained in this verse in Romans chapter 12, verse 3, where Paul says, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." Now, why do people go to AA? To be sober. And we learn that alcoholism rests in the mind. It says the problem rests in our mind. So we're trying to learn to think soberly. And not just be sober, but to think soberly when we are sober, because I think that once we've been in AA a while, we've experienced it ourselves and other people thinking like absolute maniacs when they're sober. But no, we want to think soberly, clearly, sanely. Now, how do we do that? He says here, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly. Not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. What is that? It's humility. It's anonymity. That's the way to sobriety, is through humility. It's almost like AA is in this verse. Now, can someone get sober from this verse? Well, probably if somebody actually just dedicated their entire life to not thinking more highly than they ought to think, I'm sure they would make progress. But for a lot of us, it's near impossible. We are so mangled from life and from our mistakes that we don't even know how to do that. And that is what the steps are for. That's what the 12 steps do for us, is they enable us to be more humble. They've enabled me to be humble. I am very humble. And I don't want to just say I'm kidding. I don't want to say that. So I hope you've liked this video. There's more to come. And hope you have a great day.